Hanley, and I teach in the English department of Vanier College. I'm pleased to welcome you to the 23rd Annual Symposium of the Holocaust and Genocide at Vanier College. Before we start the presentation, we'd like to thank our honorary chair, Rabbi Yehuda Sarna, as well as our partners, the Holocaust Education and Genocide Prevention Foundation, and the Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center. We also thank the Raoul Wallenberg Centre for Human Rights and the Vanier College Teachers Association for their support. We give deep gratitude to the college for financial and logistical support, and especially the Office of the Faculty of Arts, Business, and Social Sciences, the Communications Department, and the Director General's Office. Today's speaker is Angela Marinos, giving a talk entitled Hate Speech in Canada, Current Legal Landscape and Recommendations for Improvement. Angela is the Chief General Counsel at the Raoul Wallenberg Centre for Human Rights. Prior to this, she was General Counsel at the Department of Justice Canada, where she litigated more than 130 cases involving immigration, constitutional, national security, and international law. Angela has conducted trials involving concentration camp guards during the Holocaust and was the lead counsel in the Oberlander case, where she was successful in having Oberlander's Canadian citizenship finally revoked for his complicity in crimes against humanity. Angela is a graduate of Vanier College, holds a Bachelor of Arts and a Master of Arts in English Literature, as well as a Bachelor of Civil Law and Bachelor of Laws from McGill University, where she graduated with distinction. She also has a Master's in Law with a specialization in International Criminal Law from Leiden University in the Netherlands. Angela is speaking live today from Vanier College and out to you on the internet over Zoom. Those participating through Zoom are automatically muted, but can ask questions using the Q&A function. We ask that attendees in the auditorium turn your phone ringers off, and please keep noise to a minimum so that all participants, including those on Zoom, can benefit from the talk. Thank you, and welcome back to your alma mater, Angela.
Thank you so much. Merci beaucoup pour cette introduction et de m'avoir invité à cette discussion pertinente. It's really an honor to be part of this amazing symposium and to be representing the Raoul Wallenberg Centre for Human Rights. I've attended a number of talks over the week, which have all been thoughtful and thought-provoking. So congratulations to the organizers for putting on this excellent conference. Je suis tellement contente d'être ici parmi vous à Vanier. Comme vous avez entendu, j'étais étudiante ici. Ça fait déjà 38 ans, which doesn't exactly feel like yesterday, but it doesn't also feel like almost 4 decades ago. I can tell you for sure that I would have been sitting in your seat if this program had existed back when I was a student. So I'm absolutely thrilled to be back at Vanier and have so many fond memories of my time here. I learned so much, and the education I received here opened my mind to new ideas, and it forged my path to becoming a critical thinker. So my topic this afternoon is Hate Speech in Canada, Current Legal Landscape and Recommendations for Improvement. Ma présentation cet après-midi sera en anglais, mais soyez libre de poser des questions en français si vous voulez. I'll be covering 3 main topics preceded by some context. First, I'll give an overview of federal and provincial legislation. Second, I'll highlight the governing Supreme Court case on hate speech. And third, I'll outline some recommendations for improvement and ask if you have your own recommendations for improvement. So hopefully we can have a discussion. So why is hate speech so serious? It's been said many times that the Holocaust did not begin in the gas chambers. It began with words. So there's no doubt that words can hurt, but words can also heal. Taking agency can heal. Acknowledging our own pain and our own hurt can heal, and acknowledging another's pain and another's hurt can also be part of that healing process. Now, I'm not a psychologist, I'm a lawyer, but I think that when we speak of hate it's important to consider what helps us heal from the assault of hatred, and hatred is an assault. So I begin with a quote from Elie Wiesel, who said, "Action is the only remedy to indifference, the most insidious danger of all." So with that call to action, when we speak of hate, it's important to consider that hate is discriminatory, but it doesn't discriminate. And what I mean by that is that hate doesn't confine itself or limit itself to one group. It's like a cancer in our society, an assault to our democracy. So if we think of our country as a body, hate isn't just limiting itself to one organ. It doesn't just attack the lungs. It metastasizes and spreads. And it's been well documented, completely beyond dispute, that anti-Semitism is a central feature in white power movements from the KKK to the present day. There's no doubt. Before getting into the legal landscape, I thought it would be useful to provide some context. There is certainly no doubt that hate crimes have increased exponentially since October 7th. And so, in my opinion, there's the world pre-October 7th and the world post-October 7th, and those two worlds paint a different picture. So I want to talk a little bit about pre-October 7th for a few minutes, because Statistics Canada recently released, just in the last few weeks, a report of police reported hate crimes from 2018 to 2022. We don't have the numbers yet for 2023. We have to wait until summer, but I have no doubt that they will confirm what we already know. And that is that there's been a rise in hate crimes, particularly against the Jewish community. Now, okay, I put this chart in from the latest StatsCan report, and it's might be more legible to your younger eyes, but the next few slides basically extract the relevant information that I want to highlight. So the first thing to note is that the numbers in that report are police reported crimes. And here, remember that numbers don't lie, but they're only one part of the picture, because, you know, needless to say, many crimes are not reported. So when we get into the recommendations part of this discussion, one related recommendation that I have is to report the crimes, even if you think that nothing will come of it and that nothing will come of your particular experience. And as we'll see later, many of these crimes are not ultimately solved. However, reporting will give officials the evidence they need to bolster their case for more funding, more resources, because many police forces across the country have specialized hate crimes units. So what can we glean from the table? What the table shows is that the number of police reported hate crimes was highest in the Black population. We see a rise from 2018 with 295 crimes reported to 829 in 2022. So that's a triple amount of crimes, police reported crimes, in just 4 years. This is completely overwhelming, especially when we think of the post-George Floyd world, where apparently everyone and her sister was taking a knee, and so many diversity and equity programs arose out of that event. We see similarly that police reported hate crimes for East or South Asian people also rose, and there was a peak in 2020. And you think, well, what was happening in 2020? We had the pandemic. We had Trumpian type claims of the so-called China virus. The hate was going hand in hand. So this trend of increasing crimes was similar across groups. And as I mentioned earlier, we can't just look at the numbers, but we don't know that much about the context. We don't know what was the situation, what were the facts underlying these crimes. And remember constantly about the underreporting or no reporting. But one thing is clear, that there's a rise. The trend is that they are increasing from year to year. And I think this goes back to my point of hate doesn't discriminate or doesn't limit itself to one group. We see this across the board. Just for example, like the bird's eye view from the table is that the numbers doubled or close to doubled in 4 years for many communities, the South Asian community, the Arab and West Asian community, the Indigenous community. Now, in terms of police reported hate crimes for the Jewish community, again, no surprise to you, the numbers increased. 372 in 2018 to 502 in 2022. And again, remember, this is all pre-October 7th. According to the report, when the report breaks it down into race, religion, sexual orientation, in terms of religion, the Jewish community is targeted 67% of these crimes. We also cannot ignore that sexual orientation or gender identity is also part of the hate. And those crimes were also on the rise. That's also clear from the table. Now, what happens? What happens are people are charged. What the report is showing is that it's less than a third of cases, a little bit less than the average crime where you have charges. So that means 2/3 of these crimes go completely unresolved, right? So that's the bad news. I guess part of the, I wouldn't say exactly good news, is that within that third, the vast majority, over 70%, charges are ultimately laid. That's just the reality. And that's just a quick snapshot of pre-October 7th. We'll have to wait until August 2024 when we're promised the report for 2023. Now, post-October 7th, I don't need to tell you what you already know. The world has changed post-October 7th. We've seen a stark increase in hate crimes, particularly involving the Jewish community. It's just completely staggering. And I just want to show you a few of the numbers coming out of Montreal and Toronto. These are some recent reports from the Toronto Police Service in the last few weeks. So according to the Toronto Police Chief, there was a 93% of an increase in numbers of reported hate crimes since October 7th compared to the same time last year. They fielded almost 1,000 calls since October 7th, resulting in a number of arrests. And February of this year had the highest number of reported anti-Semitic hate crimes of any month in the last 3 years. Still in Toronto, there were a number of arrests and charges that have been made. And the chief noted that policing the demonstrations is costing over $10 million. At the same time, the chief also noted that after anti-Semitic crimes, what they're seeing in Toronto is the anti-LGBTQ hate crimes, second most reported, followed by anti-Black hate, anti-Arab, Muslim, and Palestinian hate. Again, hate does not discriminate. In Montreal, you know the score, like you have the lived experience beyond the numbers. I don't need to tell you about the elementary school that's targeted, the Talmud Torah school, the congregation in Dollard, the Jewish Community Center, the campus unrest. You know this. And needless to say, unfortunately, this list is not exhaustive. One thing that is interesting is when you look at the Montreal police hate statistics, just in the 5 weeks following October 7th, you see that the rise in hate was immediate. It was immediate. And you have to remember that Israel's response to October 7th did not happen on October 8th. It happened about 3 weeks later, but the numbers immediately increased, immediately. So the hate is there, and it's just kind of somehow it's crystallizing. Now, in the last couple of months, according to reports in Montreal, the police are saying that the number of hate incidents targeting both the Jewish community and the Muslim community appears to be returning to pre-October 7th numbers. Now, I'm just curious if that's your experience, because that isn't my impression at all. But again, I don't have an evidence-based picture to show you, but that's what the police are telling us. So that's just a little bit of context before we move on to the legal landscape. So what do we have? What tools are in the toolbox to deal with hate federally and provincially? So federally, I want to look at the criminal code, and I want to look a little bit at the Canadian Human Rights Act. So we'll look at those provisions. One thing that you should know is that the criminal code doesn't have, as yet, a definition of hate or hatred. What is being used is the definition from the Supreme Court of Canada, the jurisprudence and the common law, and we'll look at that. And the current Canadian Human Rights Act also doesn't mention hate speech, let alone regulate it. But there is a proposed bill. I'm sure you've heard of Bill C-63. It's only at first reading, so there might be changes that are made. But the proposed bill does put forward a definition based on the common law. The other thing that you should know is that provincially, it's all over the place. Not all provinces have legislation that deal with hate speech, including Quebec or Ontario. So the first provision that I want to highlight for you in the criminal code that deals with hate is the provision of advocating genocide. And so according to the criminal code, if you advocate or promote genocide, you're guilty of an indictable offense, and the sentence is a maximum of 5 years. We'll see with the proposed bill, the proposed change. But for now, this is what's on the books for advocating genocide. The next provision in the criminal code is section 319, and that contains 2 provisions: public incitement of hatred and willful promotion of hatred. So we have these 2 provisions. We also have possible defenses to willful promotion of hatred, and I'll show you those when we deal with anti-Semitism. And you should know that you also need the Attorney General of Canada's consent in order to initiate proceedings. So going towards the willful promotion of anti-Semitism, I want to look at this a little bit more closely, because how is anti-Semitism defined here? Everyone who, by communicating statements other than in private conversation, willfully promotes anti-Semitism by, and this is the key, condoning, denying, or downplaying the Holocaust. Now, I think we all would agree that anti-Semitism is a lot broader than condoning, denying, or downplaying the Holocaust, but that's what we have in the code. And earlier I mentioned that there were defenses to willful promotion of hatred. And those defenses also are echoed in the willful promotion of anti-Semitism. So there's one that I want to bring your attention to, which is the defense 3.1b that provides, if in good faith they expressed or attempted to establish by an argument an opinion on a religious subject or an opinion based on a belief in a religious text. So there has been a private member's bill by the Bloc Québécois leader to remove that provision from the defenses. That's just at first reading, and it's a private member's bill, so it may not go anywhere. But I invite you to look at those defenses and see if they need amending. One of the cases that has brought forward, like, you know, the possible use of these defenses is the Adil Sharkawi case. Adil Sharkawi is an imam who gave a speech several months ago, who called on, and I'm quoting, called on Allah to kill the enemies of the people of Gaza and I'm still quoting, spare none of them. So 5 months after his speech, we're still waiting to see if charges are going to be laid. The latest information that I have is that the RCMP has sent a file to the Director of Criminal and Penal Prosecutions, but we don't know why it's been 5 months. Is it is the delay caused from the prosecution side, or given that these crimes, as I mentioned, need the consent from the Attorney General of Canada to initiate proceedings, is the delay from the minister side? We simply don't know. Okay, the Criminal Code also provides a framework for the forfeiture or seizure of hate propaganda. They're in the code. It's beyond the scope here, so I'm not going to cover that. But I do want to mention a couple more provisions from the Criminal Code that can be used to combat hate, even though they're not part of the hate propaganda provisions. The first one is the mischief offense. I think this is an underutilized Criminal Code provision, but you'll see at 430 of the Criminal Code, mischief is defined as someone who obstructs, interrupts, or interferes with the lawful use, enjoyment, or operation of property, or does so with respect to any person's lawful use, enjoyment, or operation of property. So what comes to mind immediately for me is the McGill-Bronfman building. You know, what happened with the McGill-Bronfman building? Was there an obstruction, an interruption, or an interference with the lawful use, enjoyment, or operation of property? That's for the authorities to figure out, but I highlight that. And just to go back for a second, the mischief offense carries a maximum term of 10 years imprisonment. So it's interesting to look at the maximum sentences for all of these hate offenses, because when you look at advocating genocide, as I mentioned, the max is 5 years. Now, the new bill, still at first reading, proposes to increase this to life imprisonment. Now, there has been a lot of criticism of this, so we have to see if the changes actually make their way to like new law. But I think there's going to be a lot of debate about this maximum sentence. Currently, the public incitement of hatred, willful promotion of hatred, and willful promotion of anti-Semitism all carry a maximum of 2 years. The proposed bill wants to increase that to 5 years. But when we look at mischief, particularly in relation to religious property, I forgot to mention this, because under the mischief provisions, there is a particular section that includes places of worship, cemeteries, schools, daycares, residences for senior citizens, basically places that are used by identifiable groups. So the hate can be connected to these mischief offenses. And rhetorically, it makes me wonder, if you're the police or the Crown, which offenses would you want to be charging? One final point on the Criminal Code provisions that can be used in relation to hate are the sentencing principles. Now, of course, we have to get there because as we know, only a third of the cases, like there's charges, but out of those, we don't know how many, where are there convictions at the end of the day. But where we get a conviction and the judge is looking at the sentencing the person, what are the principles that the court uses? There's a number of principles, including denunciation, deterrence, rehabilitation. But one of the principles is also, was the crime motivated by hate or bias in relation to a whole bunch of characteristics, including religion, sexual orientation, age, etc. So that's another tool in the toolbox in the criminal code. Moving on to other tools in the toolbox, we have the Canadian Human Rights Act. As I mentioned, it's silent on hate speech, but it does deal with discrimination in a number of contexts, very limited contexts. So if you have hate speech directed at someone based on a prohibited ground, it could be discriminatory under the Act, but you have to remember that the Act doesn't apply in every context. It's limited in certain contexts. Provincially, as I mentioned, the Ontario Human Rights Code is silent on hate speech. The Charte des droits et libertés de la personne also silent, but some provinces do provide, they're in their codes, do provide provisions against hate speech. So these are the main legislative tools. We'll see how far Bill 63 goes. It's still at first reading, as we saw a few of the changes, including the terms of imprisonment. We see that it includes a definition of hatred taken from the Supreme Court case law. So just some questions for discussion, whether it's now or later. I've given you a brief outline of the legal tools in the toolbox. I'd like you to reflect on whether these tools are enough. And if you think they're not enough, what kind of tools would you propose? If you were the Attorney General of Canada, or if you were the Premier, what tools do we need in addition to what we already have on the books? Is it that we don't have enough law on the books? Or is it that the law is not being enforced? Is it that the authorities don't have enough education to charge? We don't know where along the spectrum the problem lies, or if it lies across the entire spectrum. Do we need more education in terms of unconscious bias or stereotypes, assumptions, tropes? Do you think the bar is too high? So when we look at the Supreme Court case law, think about, is the bar too high? What other means can we use? So I'd like you to think about these questions as we now turn to the case law. In terms of the jurisprudence, there are a number of cases across Canada and across the country, and I've drafted a report that will be published on the website of the Raoul Wallenberg Centre for Human Rights in the near future. And that report summarizes the jurisprudence from across the country, across jurisdictions, across various courts, but we simply don't have the time to get into that level of detail here. But if you're interested, just have a look in the coming months for that report. But for now, I just want to focus on the authoritative or governing jurisprudence on hate speech, which comes from a case called Whatcott from the Supreme Court of Canada. I want to highlight how the court has interpreted the legislation and just summarize what are the principles that the court has told us we have to use. So the first principle is that when you're assessing whether an expression is hate, you have to apply an objective analysis. And that is, would a reasonable person aware of the context and the circumstances view the expression as hatred? The second principle is that repugnant speech, offensive speech, isn't enough. The expression has to give rise to what the court calls detestation, vilification, abhorrence, delegitimization. So that's the bar we're looking at. Again, we can talk about whether you think this bar is too high, but keep in mind that this is meant to balance against, obviously, freedom of expression, which is also a fundamental charter right. The third principle is, what's the effect of the expression? Is it likely to expose the targeted person or community to hatred by others? And again, the person's intent, not relevant, and repugnancy, not enough. So what did the Supreme Court say about hate speech? And here I wanted to highlight 3 key paragraphs of the decision. The first paragraph deals with the court's statement that hate speech is at its core an effort to marginalize individuals that seeks to delegitimize group members in the eyes of the majority, reducing their social standing and acceptance. So that's the first thing. The second thing is when the court talks about what's the impact of hate speech on the group. And according to the court, it impacts that group's ability to respond to substantive ideas under debate. It places a barrier to the group's full participation in democracy. So again, it goes back to my original comment about hate being an assault on democracy. It's not just an assault, against one person. It's an assault against democracy. And I find this last part of this paragraph very powerful when the court says that it also forces the group to argue for their basic humanity or social standing as a precondition to participating in the deliberative aspects of our democracy. To me, these are very, very powerful words, asking the group to argue for their basic humanity. The third quote that I want to take your attention to is that what happens with hate speech? The representations that expose a community to detestation, they inspire enmity, extreme ill will. It's not just, I don't like these people. It's enmity, extreme ill will. And they seek to abuse, denigrate, delegitimize them, or render them lawless, dangerous, unworthy, and unacceptable. This basically what goes hand in hand with hate speech is othering in its most extreme form. It's dehumanization. Think about your reaction when you're looking at these words. Are these just words? I read a lot of jurisprudence, and I can tell you that you don't see this kind of powerful words coming from the court every single day. There are other decisions. Again, we don't really have time to get into them, but I just have the sites here. But I want to now move towards some recommendations. Share some thoughts on how we can improve things. So as I've been thinking about the topic, recommendations focus on 4 areas. Law enforcement, the legal community, strengthening legislation, and most important of all, dialogue and education. Because even though I'm a lawyer, the law isn't always the first tool to combat what we need to combat. Dialogue and education, in my opinion, has to come hand in hand with that. So recommendations for law enforcement, more training, more education. I mentioned the hate crimes units in police, unconscious bias training. There is only a few specialized hate crimes units across the country, but we see that the hate isn't only limited to those city centers. Increasing outreach and community relationships between affected communities, building trust is big, and where the evidence supports it, and there's reasonable grounds to believe that an offense has been committed, charges must be laid. On this point, we have to keep in mind that justice must be done and must also be seen to be done. So the bar on laying charges can't be so impossibly high that we're waiting 5 or 6 months for charges to be laid in a case where the evidence supports that a hate crime has occurred. In terms of the legal community, I think that providing more training and education to the legal community on hate crimes, particularly in this day and age, from law schools to bar associations to CPD for lawyers. I have put as a recommendation the consideration of making hate crimes a mandatory part of the law school curriculum. That Crown Counsel should receive specific training on prosecuting hate crimes, and that judges who are responsible for their own training and education, that efforts be made to also advocate for more judicial training on these crimes. In terms of strengthening the legislation, I think I touched on this when I mentioned the criminal code provision on the willful promotion of anti-Semitism. As I mentioned, it only addresses Holocaust denial or downplay or condoning, but anti-Semitism is much, much greater than this. Developing guidelines and timelines, this is never going to work. And I say that as a former DOJ person, but I can now, in my new role, advocate for this. But having timelines for the Attorney General of Canada, who I represented for over 20 years, to institute proceedings. There has to be something on the books. We have the communities have to understand if something happened, and these are crimes that the AGC needs to consent to in order to initiate proceedings. The AGC needs to be accountable. The communities can't be left to wait indefinitely, because inevitably the community ends up feeling abandoned, forgotten, which further contributes to the sense of othering. Thirdly, setting clear parameters on what type of communication are we talking about. Is it just online? What about other contexts? The hate is not just happening online. It's happening face to face. It's happening like in classrooms. It's happening across the board. What about these other contexts? The proposed bill deals with one forum, but what about others? Finally, ensuring that provincial human rights codes can address hate speech. Again, balancing this with a freedom of expression. I think perhaps most important of all is the prevention of hate. Because when we get to criminal code, well, the hate has already happened or is alleged to have happened. But how do you deal with it on the front end? And I think that's where education and dialogue comes in. And education, in my opinion, is key across the board, from elementary school to high school to university. And we have to talk to each other. I've put dialogue. And dialogue doesn't mean agreement. We're allowed to disagree. We live in a democratic society. Not everybody is going to agree. My kitchen table doesn't always agree. But having, empathy for each other without the vilification that we're seeing, that's really important. Also, we have to be able to stand up for each other across our differences, across our disagreements. And in my mind, sometimes standing up means you sit down and you listen to what the other person is saying. Question for discussion is, do you have other suggestions for tackling this problem? And so I want to end, before we open it up for discussion, I want to end with a quote from Leonard Cohen. I'm a big Leonard Cohen fan. I started in the beginning of my talk talking about how words can hurt, but words can also heal. So I'm a big believer in the healing powers of poetry and art. So I wanted to leave you with a quote from Leonard and a couple of paintings from one of my favorite artists as a potential healing force, because we can't just think about hate, we have to think about healing. So here's one of the beautiful quotes from Leonard Cohen, and I'll let you read it. I think that we as a society must also, despite the immovable landmarks of hatred, despite the solitude, depend one upon the other. And I call this becoming Wallenbergs for each other. We have to become Wallenbergs for each other. So I leave you with these two paintings by Marc Chagall. I love Marc Chagall. I couldn't decide between the two, so I'm leaving the two. And I put these two paintings in because to me, they represent displacement. They represent loneliness and the isolation of feeling like you're in the village on your own. The falling angel, all the symbols are there for displacement, but also redemption. So hopefully we can become stronger as a society. I welcome your questions, comments. Thank you so much again to Vanier for inviting me. Thank you, Toby, for organizing this wonderful conference. It's been a real honor to be here.
Thank you so much for that. That part of my brain, which I don't get to use that often. So let's start with, are there any questions here? And I recognize that it sometimes takes people a few minutes to come up with their questions. I already have a few, but I might have started out with more background in this, except for maybe Stuart. You'll go after me? Okay, so and I encourage the people online to get your questions in as well. A few things. So the first thing that I was thinking about is the categories, and I think it's a problem in human rights legislation too, and it's something that we saw with Chapter 6 in the US, like protections on campuses, or Title 6, I should say, where being Jewish doesn't fit well into a category because it's not just a religion. Not everything about being Jewish is religious practice, right? It's a people or a culture. So for Title 6 protections in the US on campus, it was by executive order, it was called like an ethno-religious group that it would apply to Jews and to Muslims. And you mentioned it somewhere about the categories that are protected, and you said, religion is one of them. But again, I don't think that you know, Judaism itself, yes, but being Jewish and the aspects of being Jewish doesn't necessarily fit. So I was wondering your thoughts on that.
Thank you for the question. The criminal code actually identifies what's an identifiable group. Like we see that in 318 section 4. So it's color, race, religion, national or ethnic origin, age, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, or mental or physical disability. And I'm looking for the one in the Canadian Human Rights Act is a similar has the similar identifiable groups, but also in the mischief section, you see in the mischief section talks about mischief motivated by bias, prejudice, or hate. And again, it follows the different identifiable groups that can be captured. Also, I think what's important is the 4.101 A to D, because here I've summarized it, but it covers, you know, places of worship, and it covers community centers that are used by an identifiable group. So when we see the community center in Dollard, for example, or you know, the Miles Nadal Center in Toronto, that's you know, that's captured because it's used by. That's right.
Does anybody want to raise their hand, or you want to let me keep going? Huh? All right.
Thank you for the presentation. Just a question that I personally have. So we've heard in the streets of Montreal calls for intifada, which is basically calling for violence. And it's a very controversial thing to say clearly that it's called for violence against Jews. How do you, as a person, as a lawyer, how do you see that? Do you think it would one day become incitement to hate, or not necessarily?
I think that that's very, very controversial, as you say. I mean, I can't tell you how a court of law would look at that, apart from what we saw in Westcott. What I can tell you for sure is that there would be a war between the experts. So you'd have like experts on both sides duking it out. And whoever was found to be more credible, more reasonable, would ultimately, and there's so many things that can play a role if we're talking about litigation, right? Because you have one side saying, but that's not our intent, or this is, like there's a whole history, blah, blah. And then, so I think there would for sure be a duking out between, expert testimony on that.
Okay. We're going to flex that part of your brain now too.
Thanks so much for the presentation. Tonight I'm going to an event at the Beth Israel, and there's very strict security before going in because they're worried about people heckling, disrupting, and preventing the speech from going on. I'm kind of hesitant about, the imprisonment for, let's say, Holocaust denial becoming like a life imprisonment. I've always believed that the best option is, good speech or just debate to hate speech. But one thing I've been seeing since October 7th is that there's the heckler's veto. Mm-hmm. And instead of airing out space, having dialogue and discussion, there are events like the one that I want to go to tonight, which might be shut down from, people outside. So I was just wondering what your perspective was on that. It's not really hate speech, but how can we promote speech? How can we try to prevent more people from shutting down speakers and organizers from being able to air their beliefs?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Stuart. I think that the dialogue, has to happen somewhere. I mean, the entrance of the community center probably isn't the place for that because the tensions are so high. But for instance, one of the things that I'm organizing as in my new role here is an assembly for grade 6 to 8 kids called Becoming Wallenbergs for Each Other. And we're going to get the kids to think about these questions of how would you like others to stand up for you? And what can you do to stand up for others? And it's going to be hopefully, there's 330 kids between grade 6 to 8 who are attending this assembly next month. And I think that is, it's a long-term, it's the long-term game of starting to have those conversations where we start to see the humanity in each other and that, my pain is your pain. And maybe there's actually a commonality here. Maybe the otherness is a commonality. And I'm hoping that those neurons will start, but it's I'm not a Pollyanna to say to you, well, we're going to be able to have this nice kumbaya dialogue outside, in certain contexts, because it's so fraught, right? It's so fraught.
So, your general thoughts about Bill C-63, and if you could follow it all with happened in Scotland recently, I think they passed another new hate speech law in the last month or so, which I've heard about covers private conversation as well.
I haven't looked at that, so I can't comment on that. I think Bill 63 is sort of still in the nascent sort of stages. It's still, and it doesn't just cover hate speech. Like there's all kinds of online, like child protection provisions about that. But in terms of the hate, I think that there's been, obviously, I'm sure you've read about Margaret Atwood, like, saying it's Orwellian and this and that. I mean, I don't know if she's actually read the legislation. I don't know if she understands what the law is providing. Like, I think there's misunderstanding and misapprehension on that. Now, is the law perfect? Is it fair to have life imprisonment for advocating genocide? I think that's, even the former Chief Justice of Canada, Justice McLaughlin, said, I think that's going to be challenged. And, I would agree with that. But it's an attempt to deal with this. And I think that having all those criticisms now, that's the place to have the criticisms, because the bill still has to go through the process. And they can tweak, they can refine, they can hear, and everybody has an interest in combating this. Like, the government wants to deal with it, so let's get a good law on the books. But whether is it gonna cover everything? I'm not sure. Even as a lawyer, I'm not sure that the law is going to be able to address everything.
Any other questions?
So I cautioned Toby when she asked me if I would introduce you that, my own politics lean towards being a Miltonian free speech absolutist. And she said, well, I come to the talk and talk about it a bit. And, okay, so one of my reservations when we talk about hate speech legislation of any kind is that even as we look at the jurisprudence that you presented, the piling on of language that is used to define what we mean by what we say hate speech is invites just further analysis of what those words mean, and then what the words to define those words mean. And I think when we look at crime historically, we have a very clear understanding of action versus inaction, and criminal action versus criminal inaction. And that rather than parsing out, is this language hateful? Is the word intifada a hateful word? Is this hate speech? Is this an incitement to violence? That some of our efforts might be better spent on actually enforcing against criminal action that are taken. And I think in the Montreal context, certainly since October, that I feel like our police efforts could be expended to police actual actions that are going on in our streets instead of hand waving a lot about what people are saying on the internet. I think that we should be marshaling our police resources in those areas manifestly, potently, and effectively. And so I sometimes wonder if policing hate speech doesn't become a convenient out to meaningful action on physical crime. One of the other reservations that I have, and I would be interested in your thoughts on this, as far as hate speech and the enforcement of against hate speech is concerned, is the degree to which hate speech is often what is politically expedient for those in power to condemn at a particular moment. And what I mean by that is that our leaders, I appreciate that sounds a little bit more conspiracy oriented, but our leaders are very willing to use divisive and othering language in pursuit of a particular agenda at a particular time. And I think of, as you quote the former President Trump on the subject of the Kung flu, Hillary Clinton on basket of deplorables, that we tend to other our political adversaries, and very rarely do we see any sort of enforcement of hate speech. And I appreciate the U.S. context much different than in Canada, but even our own Prime Minister has said some perhaps dodgy things about groups of people in this country. That when it is politically expedient, we use language to other our adversaries. And I'll go back even further in time. I think about my own grandfather and men of his generation who volunteered to fight on behalf of this country and went to his grave hating the Germans. He hated them for what they had done to his friends and peers during the war, and he never forgave them. And that was certainly a politically expedient use, marshaling of hatred in order to get people to go and fight an adversary and to kill them to a particular end. And we saw similar rhetoric during the war on terror. I appreciate that the impulse of hate speech legislation is to protect citizens from other citizens, but it seems that the focus of those hate speech actions tends to very often be on the little guy, the citizen, the individual, less so on the politically powerful when they marshal this sort of speech for political purposes. And do you think that there is a way that this legislation or hate speech legislation could be used in the future to target the more powerful rather than the less powerful effectively?
That's a really big question. I mean, like and as I'm listening to you speak, I'm thinking to myself, I am no longer counsel for the Minister of Justice. I'm no longer counsel for various federal ministers. So I'm not here to say that this Bill 63 is that should be supported. That was the old Angela Marinos who defended the legislation in court. Here, I think we have to be critical thinkers, right? And we have to look at, well, what is this law here to do? This law is not here to be a thought police, right? And the law is not certainly going to control, and the law has no interest in controlling what people think of their adversaries or their, political leaders. Like, you can think whatever you want. So the law is very specific on hate speech, right? It has to give rise to what the court is calling vilification or delegitimization. And it's not an accident that I chose the Sharkawi quote, because to me, that's a very clear example. When the person says spare none, that's much clearer to me than a lot of like some other speech, right? So, and I'm thinking, if that doesn't trigger a charge, what's going to trigger a charge, right? And we don't know why that is. Where is the file sitting right now? Who is looking at it? Who's thinking about, the pros and cons? It's like, and is that the duty of the AG to be thinking about those things? That's the prosecutor's role, right? To think about, do I have a reasonable prospect of conviction? I charge, and then let's go forward in court. Let's see what happens. Let's see the defense. Let's duke it out. Your dad, hating the Germans. that I can't address that, right? You know, are we gonna have a society where we all love each other? No, that's not what this toolkit is about, right? And I guess my interest is it that the tools are not enough? Because, you know, it's the natural inclination for lawyers, politicians, you know, to like, let's create another law. Like, we need another law. We need something else on the books. But is that the issue, or is the issue something else? Right. So it's a very complex issue about where does, you know, hate begin? You know, where does disenfranchisement begin? How do we nip that in the bud? I don't have an answer for that. I mean, I've attended talks throughout this week where people have mentioned really interesting ideas about combating hate, but I think in many ways it's outside the parameters of what the law can do.
Thank you. See, I'm never sure if it's on. So I'm waiting for you, Sha. No? Yeah, you don't have anything? But let me give you the mic because we do have people online who can't hear us otherwise.
Hi, my name's Cheryl. I teach in communications. And
Hi, Cheryl.
I like I said, I don't think necessarily there's an answer for this question, but I'm hearing a lot of students talking about what they're experiencing in the hallways, you know, things that are being said as they're passing by, you know, posters being defaced. And there's not really a way to monitor these things, even with cameras, but there's tangible impacts on many different student groups. And this is happening today and yesterday and the day before to many different student groups. And so I noticed that you mentioned at some point in terms of legislation, what do we do to the things that are happening on the streets? And so for my concern, it's like the impact on different groups of students in the hallways. And I don't know if you have any reflections on that.
I don't know, because I'm not an educator, but and I don't know if this is just going to sound naive. You're the one who's in the classroom. I'm not in the classroom and I'm no longer on campus. But what about just talking about the elephant in the room, right? That's hard. But, you know, what about, you know, I'm not saying to point fingers, but what about talking about, you know, why is this being done, and how, you know, because something is motivating that, but something is also motivating the students who are feeling silenced, right? So there's, and there's not a lot of discussion, you know. I mean, I went to law school during the second referendum, and there was a lot of tension between the Anglophone students and the Francophone students, you know, with Francophone students saying, well, you know, I'm having a wee party, but I'm sure you won't come. And I'm thinking, well, how do you know? Like, you don't know what my politics are, but there's all kinds of assumptions that are being made on campuses all the time through different issues. This is just the point that I'm trying to make. And we can either ignore it and just kind of, you know, teach your course, or there can be, I don't know, a way of addressing it. But I don't know if there's a forum in the classroom. I mean, you're teaching communications, but you're also not a psychologist at the same time. So I don't know. It's much more complicated than the parameters of my talk. But I think it's certainly a struggle that schools are facing, right? Like, we hear that, you know, all the time.
Thank you. And again, I think that was really more of a comment for us all to think about in relation to this, but you have made the point, Angela, that what you're talking about here are legal tools, and that's not everything, right? Sometimes when you teach a room of students anything about law, they think that's the solution for everything. I wanted to ask something, but more make an observation. You said it could be that there aren't the right tools in place or available, or it could be a question of enforcement. And what I've been hearing is that there's a lot of enforcement issue. I don't know if you know, but right now in Montreal, there's an injunction against protest within 50 meters of certain community buildings. And I did not know that there was the thing about mischief outside certain types of property, because if that exists already, then why was that required for enforcement? It shouldn't have been,
Right,
right? The tool
Right,
already existed.
right.
You know, like anecdotally, police are being held back from enforcing. And they've made that obvious to, for example, the lawyer who served the injunction could tell that the police had, the second they got the injunction, they started enforcing.
Mhm.
But they could have enforced
They could
before
have
that.
enforced
from what you're
before,
saying.
right.
So to me, that sounds.
The law is there, right? Like that's why I highlighted the mischief provisions,
Yeah.
right? And mentioned the Bronfman, I mean, that's just one example, right? But it fits clearly within mischief.
Yeah.
It fits clearly with two of those provisions, like the actual mischief of the property, but also preventing lawful use of others. You know, if you're a student, you can't go into the building to learn. That's mischief.
Right. So they had to switch to Zoom that
Right,
day.
right.
And so, but that goes to Brock's point. I don't necessarily think these are a speech issue. I think this is about enforcing the laws about
right.
other people's rights to speak or other people's
agree.
rights to their property.
I totally agree. And that's why I think, there needs to be more training, I guess. Why the police know the law. Like, do they need a primer on the hate speech provisions or the mischief provisions? I'm not sure they do. So what's happening here, right? I mean, what's going on? Because there's you have, in my mind, you have the prevention, which is like the education, like talking to kids, like the combating before hate, foments. You have like the speech. And then what happens after the speech, right? Is there, like, when I say speech, the expression, like, is there, do the police go in? Why aren't they going in? What's happening? Is it a resource issue? Is it that, they think they're not going to get the conviction, or, it depends if it's, the police laying charges or the prosecutor, right? Like, because different provinces have different rules. But what's happening here? Is it once charges are laid and there is a court hearing, is it that the bar is too high and the judges are applying, they're saying, well, this is just, this is just expression. And I've seen cases like that where, youth they go on a vandalism spree, for example. There's a case in Nova Scotia where they put, KKK, they put the N-word on the one Black family's like driveway. And they were not convicted. So it's like, where is the problem here, right? Maybe it's everywhere. So we have to attack it on like multiple levels.
Thank you very much for that. Are there any other questions? Okay.
It's just a comment, but just to answer the question you just asked, I think it's a lack of leadership. I think when leaders, political leaders, or other people who implement law enforcement, they don't react. It also gives the impression that it's okay to do these things, to block access to, let's say, what we had, the Jewish Federation, synagogues, and it could become the norm, unfortunately, because if nobody is reacting, if nobody is speaking up to it, it gives the impression that it's normal to do these things.
It emboldens.
And that's what we're facing, unfortunately, today in this country.
So thank you for that final comment, and I thank you so much.
Thank you for
here
having
and
me.
for coming back to Vanier.
been
I
lovely.
hope that you get a chance to walk around and see
Yeah.
what's changed.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I hope you'll have a few minutes for people to come speak to you
For sure.
quietly here, and I will shut the webinar so that you can do that.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much.